Sanibonani, Dumelang, hello everybody. Mama H here, and you know that means that this is life sciences. So what are we doing at the moment? Well, we're in the middle of a series of lessons on population ecology. And the focus of this particular lesson is human populations. So I've got some questions for you. Have you ever wondered how many humans are alive on Earth right now? Right now, how many of us do you think inhabit this planet? Why don't you take some guesses? Think about it, because we're going to answer that question a little later in the lesson. And secondly, what is the carrying capacity of the Earth in terms of the human population? Now remember, we've already learnt what carrying capacity means. It means how many members or individuals of a population a certain area can support. And in this case, our area is the entire world. So, how many humans could the entire world support? That's what we're asking when we say, what is the carrying capacity of the Earth? Do you think that we've still got space to go before we get to that carrying capacity? Have we met the carrying capacity? Or, in fact, are we over the carrying capacity? So there's a couple of questions for you to think about and bear in mind, and those questions we're going to answer for you during the lesson. So let's move on. This is our concept map that shows us where we are. We've introduced the subject of population ecology. We've looked at population size, growth curves, interactions in the environment, and this is the focus of our lesson today, human populations. And we're going to look in this particular lesson at the growth curve that human populations show. We're going to look at something called age, gender distributions, and we're going to conclude looking at the future. Where is all of this taking us? So that is our concept map for this lesson. Now you have some key words that are going to be important, along with all the keywords and the vocabulary that you have already learned. What words are going to be important for this particular lesson? Well, first of all, this idea or concept of age, gender distributions. When we talk about a distribution, we're talking about how organisms are arranged in a particular context. This set of terms, estimate, forecast, prediction, and consequence, these are all terms that we're going to need in order to focus on where we're going in the future. So as we get to these particular terms, in the context of the lesson, we'll unpack the terms and help you understand the new glossary. But remember, these terms should be added to your vocabulary in your glossary so that you understand them, you learn them. When you see them pop up in exams, you know exactly what to do. Let's move on. In terms of revision or reminding ourselves of where we stand, we know what a population is. It's a group of individuals of the same species, and in this case, we're talking about the human species living and interbreeding in a particular area. Now, for other populations, that particular area seemed to be localized. But when we talk about the human population, remember, humans have the ability to move all over the planet. So for the context of human populations and human ecology, the particular area is the Earth. So we've got a huge area that we're looking at human populations. We know also that populations change in size over time, and we need to see how does this apply to the human population. You've also learned that a growth curve is a graph that is going to illustrate the changes in population size over time. So these are all ideas that we already know and we're confident with, and now we need to apply them to human populations. So we're going to begin our exploration looking at the growth curves. We know that populations grow positively or get bigger, and negatively, in other words, get smaller over time. And we've already discussed all the parameters and factors that cause this growth change. So we've learned about two growth curves. This one, the exponential growth curve, and this one, the logistic growth curve. And I'm asking you, which do you think will apply in terms of the human population? Well, we see that the human population, if we take it, estimated population in minutes and time on our x-axis, we see that, goodness me, what kind of growth curve is that? That is an exponential growth curve. So we need to say why. Why is the human population showing us an exponential growth curve? We're going to take a short break and you're going to consider this question. You're going to work out why you think humans have an exponential growth curve and not a logistic growth curve. So put your thinking hats on, and after the break, we'll look at the solution to this question. Welcome back. We're looking at human populations, and in particular at the moment we're focusing on growth curves of the human population. Now, before the break we said that the human population had an exponential growth curve. All right? So what does this mean? We're seeing that our population is growing exponentially over time. You also know that an exponential growth curve can turn into a logistic growth curve, and then our J-shaped graph over time will start taking on the typical shape of an S-shaped logistic growth curve. What happens to turn that growth curve from exponential to logistic? Now you need to think back to previous lessons and remember that this deceleration phase and then our equilibrium phase is brought on by limiting factors. So when there are limiting factors in the environment, like amounts of food, nesting spaces for little birds, we know that these limiting factors control the population. Now, here's the curved ball for human populations. What if you could control the limiting factors? What if you can remove limiting factors as something that is controlling your population? All right, think about that. What if you could find ways to control the environment instead of the environment controlling you? And this is what has happened in terms of human population growth, and it's why we see the human population growth curve as being exponential even today. So let's look at these early human populations. Early human populations, the growth curve would have been very much like the growth of any other animal, large mammal living at the times. Our growth curve would have been very, very slowly getting larger and larger. Small number of offspring at a time. Humans only reproduced 1 or 2 maximum babies at a time. Late sexual maturation, really only maturing probably around 10 to 12 years of age. High degree of parental care. All of this means that there is a low growth rate. And of course, the limiting factors in the environment, disease, food, shelter, other predators who found humans to be extremely tasty. Right? So the early humans had a very harsh life with lots of limiting factors, keeping the population growth rate down. Now, the population therefore grew very slowly during its early history. As we've said, slow population growth. But humans then found ways of making tools. And of course, agriculture started. They could use tools in order to control the ground, to plant and gather food. And they found ways, therefore, of controlling the environment rather than allowing the environment to control them. So the use of tools, the slow introduction of using these tools to help them provide themselves with food, this was an important first step in terms of controlling the environment. Now, instead of just relying on plant food that they found as hunter-gatherers, they began to cultivate crops. And as soon as you cultivate crops close to where you are living, you're saving energy. You no longer have to wander around, hopefully, looking for food crops. We now are growing them on our doorstep. So we can look after them, we can carry water there, we can chase away the birds that want to eat our crops that we are growing. Do you see how humans are slowly starting to control those limiting factors rather than the factors control them? Along with crops, domesticating certain animals meant that they could not only eat the animal, but they could also use the animal as another tool. And so, once again, the hunters didn't have to necessarily range far away from home looking for meat to eat. They could cultivate animals, crops, and yet another step forward in controlling the environment rather than letting the environment control them. The home base is a very important idea or concept because it means that females offspring, even older people in the little family unit, could be protected. And once you start protecting, particularly your young ones, this means that you're giving them a better chance to survive. And if you give the little ones a better chance to survive, they grow up to be able to have offspring of their own. All of the things that we've spoken about point to a way of increasing your population because you are controlling the environment rather than the other way around. For example, for other animals, mammals living in the area, baboons maybe, lions, all of those organisms, the environment controlled their survival and reproduction rate. And then we start to see a very important step forward in terms of controlling the limiting factors. Technology has enabled humans to increase the carrying capacity of habitats. We've already seen that. But what we've also got is the control, coming into this idea, the control of mortality. We can now make sure that our offspring have sufficient food. We can now make sure that we are protecting our offspring and all the members of our family group. So we are controlling mortality. And you need to remember that mortality was something, a concept that controlled the environment. So if we are able to control the environment, it means we are removing these important limiting factors and constraints. And so we see that the human population growth curve over a period of time is most definitely exponential. In terms of controlling mortality, we see that around about the 1600s, the graph moves from being just a steady increase in terms of billions to launch into this exponential growth curve. What has happened around this time? Well, around the 1600s, we started to see the rise of medicine. We started to see that people could live longer and other people could reach maturity in order to have children of their own because of medicine. Instead of many organisms in the population dying from disease, we are now able to see that humans start to medicate, to treat the individuals that are ill, that are hurt. They're finding ways to remember that diet is important, and a good diet will keep you a lot healthier. So not only are we making sure that we control the environment, we're now controlling parameters such as natality and mortality. And therefore, we've got to the point where we control the environment, which means that the population can soar in numbers. So humans have found ways to interfere with natural processes. Mortality, natality, human lifespans are lengthened. People produce now more offspring in their lifetime because they have medicines, they have improved medical care. And now we have to see what are the consequences of increased natality, decreased mortality. to a population. We know that we are going to take away limiting factors if we control the environment to provide us with food, if we make tools and technology. But now, what if we even control population parameters, such as natality and mortality? What are the consequences of this? Well, I think you should be able to see that one of the first consequences is our population growth is increasing in an exponential fashion. So instead of the population growing, but then reaching the carrying capacity and coming to some kind of stability, which would have meant a logistic growth curve, we see that we have interfered so much with population parameters that the growth curve becomes exponential instead of logistic. So when we're looking at human population growth curves, we're looking at something that is very different to any other similar organism living in the wild. It's almost like we're looking at a population of bacteria growing in a test tube where we keep adding food and we keep the oxygen rates high. We've removed all the kinds of natural limiting factors, including we are treating those bacteria to keep them healthy and to stop disease and anything that's going to bring about an early mortality rate. Therefore, we have, as humans, interfered with natural processes in the environment in order to ensure that our growth curve is not logistic, but is exponential. And I think you understand there are problems associated with this. What do we do with all the waste, with all the pollution that our technology is producing? What are we doing as we manipulate the carrying capacity of the earth? So we're going to then move on to see what do we mean by age, gender distributions, and keep these questions in mind for what the consequences are for the future of not only the human population, but the future of the earth as the human population seems to grow and grow and grow. So we're going to make sure that we move now from growth curves to age, gender distributions. And now I think your brains are full of information, so it would be a good idea to have a short break, and I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. We are looking at human populations. We've looked at how humans have manipulated their own growth curves, and now we're going to look at a different way of understanding the population, the human population in a specific area. So we've been looking at the population of humans in terms of the whole world. Now let's localize and look at the human population in certain countries, for example. And we're going to focus on the human population as it has grown in South Africa. So a kind of graph that helps us to understand this information is what we call an age-gender distribution. Sometimes this is also called an age-gender graph, and sometimes it's called an age-gender pyramid. So you might see in your textbooks different terms used to describe exactly the same thing. So what is an age gender distribution or an age pyramid? It's a graph, first of all, and it has a pyramid shape to show the age as well as the gender structure. So we're looking at females versus males in a population. And what is interesting is not only are we saying how many males to how many females in the population, we're also looking at the age. So we're going to see the proportion of the population that is male or female, and the proportion is going to be distributed or shared out, organized into our different age groups. So an age gender distribution is quite complex when you look at it for the first time, but once you know what you're analyzing, it becomes very useful and a lot easier. So let's look at one of these distribution graphs. These are three very general age gender distributions, not for any particular country, but what they're doing is they're showing us three different patterns of population growth: expanding, contracting, and stationary. So expanding would mean a growing population, contracting would mean a decreasing population that is not growing or is growing negatively, and a stationary graph is going to show us a population in equilibrium. So let's have a look. On our y-axis, we have the ages, and notice that we've broken our ages into ranges, very similar as we use a histogram to record ranges of data. But here our ranges are going up the y-axis. So at the bottom of our graph, we're going to show how many in our population are in the age group 0 to 4. We take a step up, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, all the way up to over 85. Along the x-axis, and we have percentage. What percentage of the population is in this particular age range? So on this graph, we've got 10%, 0%, and 10%. Now that might seem very strange to you until you realize that 0 is like another axis, and 10% is showing us the females in this age range. And on the other side of the 0 axis, we've got the males. So at any age range, let's take the 30 to 34 age range, we can reach across or read across, and we can see that about 4% are made up of the females, and slightly less, maybe 3%, are made up of males. And when our population is growing, we've got lots of young children in the population, we see this typical pyramid structure. When we see that there are less young children than what there are adults, we see that our pyramid is a little bit skewed and a little bit upside down, and this shows us that our population is decreasing. When we have straight lines going up our population, so that we see that we've got more or less the same number of males and females in each age range, up until the time when we see that natural causes are going to cause deaths, then we have a stable or stationary population growth rate. If we look at the South African population growth rate, we're going to move from 1950, where our population was at 13,628,434. We're starting down here, and we're going to try and trace how the population grows right up to the early and mid-2000s, and even predicting further into the future. So we can see that in 1950, our population growth rate showed the typical expanding pattern. Large numbers of very young children and decreasing numbers of people as we got older and older. So we're going to take this South African population age, gender distribution, and after the break, we're going to follow this distribution from year to year to year to see how the South African population has changed over time. What you need to remember is that we can produce an age-gender distribution for other countries, and we can see that certain countries will have stable populations. Other countries may have contracting populations. And if we add the contracting and the stable and the expanding data together, overall we find that there are more countries in the world with the same kind of age-gender distributions as South Africa, which means that overall human populations are expanding and growing. But after the break, we'll make sure that we explore this concept in a lot more detail. Don't go too far away. I'll see you just now. Welcome back. We are looking at human populations. We have looked at what the growth curve looks like for human populations. We've looked at age, gender distributions, and now we're going to focus on what are the consequences of the human population growth rate for the future. Big questions, important questions, and certainly questions that you, as the young people who are one day going to be making very important decisions about the future of our planet, these are questions that you need to think about very carefully. So, looking at the future, these are the key words that I spoke to you earlier on about that we are going to be focusing on. When we estimate something, I suppose you could call it a guess, but it's a very informed guess, and you need to look at data in order to make the guess. So it's not just simply, oh, I think, it's I think based against what the data says. A prediction and a forecast are very similar. They are looking at what we estimate will happen in the future. So forecast looks at the future, and a prediction is something that we state that we think, given the current data, the future will look like. Remember that when we look at consequences, we're looking at what is going to happen. We've got certain results that we need to expect. These are consequences that we need to bear in mind if we're going to be able to manage the future. So these are key words that you're going to see associated with the next part of the work that we look at. Now, when we make predictions and we look at consequences, it means we're looking into the future, but based on patterns and data that we have in the past. And scientists have said that going right forward to the year 2100, we must expect the population of South Africa to start leveling off. And we see that that deceleration is probably going to start taking place at around 2050. So the graph that I showed you before the break was here at 1950. What happens in the next 50 years? Because look at what scientists predict. They predict that from moving from that typical age pyramid of an expanding population, scientists are predicting that we're going to be moving towards a more stationary population growth. So 1950, this was the graph that I originally showed you, that showed a definite expanding population pattern. By the time the South African population had moved from 1950, 40 years later, into 1990, we see the same kind of pattern. These two patterns are very, very similar. And so if we put this onto a line graph, we'd see starting 1950, going up to 1990, exactly as the age gender distribution indicates, we see an expansion in the South African human population. Let's take it a little bit further forward. Let's now go to 2015 and compare that with 2020. What do we see? We see that we have not got such a steep graph happening with that typical expanding population. We're starting to see that this is becoming a little bit more stable. And so up to 2020 on our graph, we're starting to see the beginnings of a deceleration. And therefore, we move into the area of making predictions in 2100 that original curve became modified, and scientists predict that we would have reached a stage of stationary growth or stability. South African population would have hit the carrying capacity of the country, the particular area that the South African population is growing in. This means that limiting factors will now control the human population. It means that the human population is no longer able to simply grow. We're going to start seeing consequences: running out of food, running out of water, increase in human waste, which means pollution, and that these things are going to start impacting negatively on the South African population. And it's not just the South African population. We're exploring that because this is our home, but we see similar patterns in so many other developing countries as well. And that leads us to then say why. The number of humans is steadily increasing, but the number of natural resources is decreasing. And these natural resources are, of course, the things that are our limiting factors. The limiting factors, things like food, water, space, the amount of waste that is building up is also very important, because very often the amount of waste and pollution that builds up impacts negatively on natural resources, such as water, for example. If the water is contaminated, that means although it might physically be there, it's undrinkable or unusable, and so therefore the natural resource has decreased. So as the human population increases in size, so the numbers of natural resources decrease. And we've hit the point, never before in human history, that limiting factors are starting to overturn our fighting against those limiting factors. And the limiting factors indicate that we have hit carrying capacity. Maybe we've actually even gone beyond the carrying capacity of South Africa for the number of humans in the country. Another prediction relating to consequences is that as the human population increases in millions, so does the extinction rate of other populations that we share the space with. So humans are not only poisoning and using up natural resources, we are causing the extinction of other populations. I think that you're very aware, particularly in South Africa, of the rhino population and how hunting and poaching of the rhinos is bringing that population rate down until we're starting to see extinctions happening. And the rhinos are just one very large and prominent example. There are many other amphibians, insects, and other small important organisms in the environment that are going extinct because humans are in some way making their environment negative, taking away the space, taking away their natural resources. So extinction rates increasing is a very important consequence of the increase in the human population. This is a very interesting graph that will help us make predictions and look at consequences in terms of comparing the population growth of developed and developing countries over the last 300 years. And we see that developed countries, we see that there is an increase. It starts to become exponential, but around about 1940, 1950, we start to see stabilization. But in developing countries that have less access to education, to medical assistance, we see that that growth rate becomes exponential. And if we are going to be looking at the world population 1950 to 2050, we see that in 1960, the human population passed the 3 billion point. The 4 billion point came in the mid-70s. The 5 billion point came in the late 1980s. Around about 2000, we hit the 6 billion mark. And in about 2011, we hit the 7 billion mark. So you can see that this is growing at an exponential rate. Scientists indicate or make the prediction that we're going to hit the 8 billion mark in 2025. So remember what I told you or asked you at the beginning of this lesson. How many humans do you think there are on Earth currently? Let's look at the growth curve, and we will see that in the mid-2020s, we are heading towards 8 billion. Now, in the past, in the years around 3 and 4 billion, even up to 5 billion, do you know what happened around those times? Humans celebrated and said, yes, we've hit the 4 billion mark, we've hit the 5 billion mark. And as humans and science became more aware of, oh no, there are terrible consequences of this, there's less and less reason to celebrate this increase in growth, because we know that with the increase in growth, terrible consequences are happening, and we see these consequences today. People starving, fights and wars being fought over arable or land that can be used for farming, over clean water. We see huge debates and the consequences of climate change as we pump more and more of our waste into the atmosphere. And so the question I want to leave you with today, should we celebrate the day of 8 billion? Is it something that we should be celebrating? Or is it something that we should be looking at very, very seriously? And that day of 8 billion will come around when you are young adults and when you are making the policies that control how we're going to handle things like climate change, population growth. You are the ones who are going to be making those decisions, and it's coming up very, very shortly. Let's have a look at a summary of what we've covered today. Humans are able to control, and not only control, but manipulate the factors that limit other populations. Humans have increased the carrying capacity of the earth for the human population. We have more food because we grow it. We're able to manipulate factors such as mortality with the use of medicines. And as a result, the human population growth curve is an exponential curve, and very importantly, there are serious consequences for us in terms of what is going to happen to the earth, to the other organisms that we share the earth with, and to the human population in the future. So, if we have a look at our topic mind map, we can see that we've reached the end of our work on population ecology. And we are going to do some revision exercises coming up, but I think I want to leave you with the very sobering thought. You are going to be the ones in control. You are the lawmakers of the future. How are you going to ensure that the human population and the way that it is growing and the way that it is controlling the environment don't in fact bring about a huge extinction of other organisms and impact negatively on our own population? But from me, for today, this is Mama H saying goodbye.